right, so welcome to the Rediscovery channel, where each week one of us tells the other a story that they may or may not have heard of. And that's the idea that this way we rediscover history together. And this week it's my turn, if I'm not mistaken. And I have a story, and it's actually about a book I read about al-Andalus. Do you know anything about al-Andalus, Ivor?
Are you saying al-Andalus as in the southern part of Spain?
Yeah, exactly. So maybe a little bit more. The book I read is
I've been there.
yeah, I know. The book I read is called the Myth of the Andalusian Paradise by Darío Fernández-Morera.
Great.
Great. So, yeah, and maybe a bit of a disclaimer here to start it off. I want to go into this topic from a perspective of finding truth, and not from it's not motivated by hate, because I think hate is actually, unless you're actually going to do something with it, it's actually a really harmful emotion. It just leads to anxiety and depression, in my view. But anyway, so I think it's an interesting topic, and it's easy to get angry about it because in this book goes a little bit into how in popular culture, Islamic Spain is described as kind of like this paradise of the Jewish, Christians, and Muslims living together in harmony. And it was like a golden age of science, and there's just so much, right? And actually right, maybe right. So he actually goes into a little bit about why this might be. So Darío, so he actually takes some quotes from modern scholars, right, that are praising Andalusia for its wonderful tolerance, great cultural and technical achievements compared to the medieval, backwards Roman Visigoth inhabitants, and the wonderful convivencia, which is the coexistence between the Muslims, the Jews, and Christians. And then what he did is he compared it to some historians that were alive at the time, both Christian as well as Muslim. And he kind of like gives you a glimpse into what life was actually like. And it's like day and night in many cases. And I find this to be, again, very interesting. I don't want this to become a show of myth busting necessarily, but it is interesting to see how far this perception has traveled within the popular culture, but also within the academic world, for whatever reason, right? And I'll address that a little bit more, what Darío thinks about that.
I think you should say the academic world, because the popular culture doesn't really know anything about Spain, especially here in the United States. They don't know anything. They think that Spain is just like Mexico, and they don't know that most people don't even know that it used to be ruled by Muslims. Even though when I was in high school, they did a little bit, not much, but they did. No, actually, I don't even remember learning about it much when I was in high school. I mainly remember in college. But yeah, I mean, I think it's taught in high school. I just don't remember what they said about it. Probably not much at all.
Yeah, I think I'm not, to be honest, I'm not super familiar with this history either until I read this book. It was, I think it was one of these videos by Neil deGrasse Tyson. Isn't he like a popular kind of...
He's a science guy, kind of like Bill Nye, the science guy, but I've never really watched him.
So he talked, I think there was one of these videos where he painted this exact picture. And yeah, but if I'm talking about popular culture, like there's a lot of blogs out there, big blogs that have a lot of visits, like a lot of traffic, and they paint this really ideal view, right? Of like, oh, the dark medieval times in Europe, and then you have this source of enlightenment, right? The people that are keeping the ancient texts of the of Aristotle and the Greeks alive, which we've addressed this before, right? In the Carolingian Renaissance, that this is actually couldn't be farther from the truth.
Yeah.
It was actually most of the times it was Christian monasteries that were keeping these texts alive, and only very few of them were kept and translated several times. By the way, by Christians that were in conquered lands. Anyway, they were translated to Arabic, and those were then handed back into the Christian world. But yeah, so maybe to go a little bit into to what Darío writes about the potential motivations, and I'm going to quote here. Quote. Yes, perhaps writers have thought that the artistic achievements of al-Andalus cannot withstand a more realistic appraisal of its society. Perhaps it has to do with what economists call stakeholder interests and incentives, which affect the research of academics in the humanities no less and perhaps even more than those in the sciences. Perhaps it has to do with psychologists call motivated blindness, which inhibits an individual's ability to perceive inconvenient data. Perhaps it has to do with the innocence of intellectuals. Perhaps it is simply the result of shoddy research by a number of university professors, repeated by many journalists. Or perhaps since the 18th century Enlightenment, hey, we've talked about that as well, the critical construction of a diverse, tolerant, and happy Islamic Spain has been part of an effort to sell a particular cultural agenda, which would be undermined by the recognition of a multicultural society wrecked by ethnic, religious, social, and political conflicts that eventually contributed to its demise. A multicultural society held together only by the so yeah, that's kind of his motivation, I guess, to and right why he thinks that maybe some of these intellectuals, like a lot of them are also like there are a lot of Arabists around that are then paid for by money coming out of places like Kuwait and Qatar, and they're paying a lot of money for these chairs, even if it's in European or U.S. universities, they are funded with Middle Eastern money.
Oil money.
So yeah. So anyway, let's look at a couple quotes from these what do you call them? These intellectuals. All right, so first one, quote, on the intellectual level, Islam played an important role in the development of Western European civilization by passing on both the philosophy of Aristotle and its own scientific, technological, and philosophical tradition. Religious tolerance remained a part of Islamic law, although its application varied with social, political, and economic circumstances. So this is something from the Oxford University Press, 2009. Next quote. In the Middle Ages, there emerged two Europes. Muslim Europe, secure in its defenses, religiously tolerant, and maturing in cultural and scientific sophistication. On the other hand, the Christian Europe, an arena of unceasing warfare in which superstition passed for religion and the flame of knowledge sputtered weakly. So that's from a book called Islam and the Making of Europe, Norton Press, 2008. Final quote. The standard bearers of tolerance in the early Middle Ages were far more likely to be found in Muslim lands than in Christian ones. So that was one by Tony Blair in 2007, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, they're so tolerant that you only have to pay them a regular tax to keep them from sawing your head off. And then even then, maybe they still will kidnap your daughter to to as war booty to give to one of their sons, like they still do in Egypt right now with the Coptic community. And then when they do it, you have no recourse to do anything about it because the government is not on your side. You're a second class citizen, you know. And like I don't want to take too much from your story,
Yeah.
but
Well,
for the
yeah.
American audience, a way you can think of being of the Muslim countries is think in terms of Jim Crow, where if you're not a Muslim, you have a separate set of laws under the legal system that puts you at a lower status, kind of like black people did when Jim Crow was going on. It's not a perfect analogy, but that's pretty similar. Anyways, go ahead, continue with your story. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. And please remember, like, I don't want this to be out of hate. I just want it to come out of knowledge because I think the truth is revealing enough, right? So,
Yeah,
um,
that's what it
and
is, though. That's what they
yeah,
do.
I mean, it's the truth is what it's about, and that's the idea. Like, like this is so okay. So this is an entire book. I can't cover everything. You also mentioned a couple points that I do want to cover. But I'll be sure to link the book in the description of the video or podcast wherever you watch this or listen to this. And I just it's just baffling. Like this myth, it's so huge. How can this be still be alive? And it makes you wonder how many other myths are out there. But let's go ahead and start with the Islamic conquest of Spain. It started in the year 711 when Tariq Ibn Ziyad landed in Gibraltar, and it ended almost 700 years, over 700 years later, in 1492 with the fall of Granada and the completion of the successful Reconquista of Spain, the Reconquest. So in these long periods, there were actually many different rulers, including the Umayyad Caliphate, the Almofarid rule, the Almohad rule, and finally there was the Kingdom of Granada. So Spain is actually really interesting.
Umayyad came first, right?
Sorry?
Didn't Umayyad come first?
Yes,
I think
yes.
Umayyads were the original Muslim caliphate. Is that right?
They are the second caliphate.
Oh, but
So
they're the ones that were in charge when Spain was invaded.
yes, and that's actually one of the points that they mentioned. These scholars say, well, the motivations weren't religious; it was
Right.
just about and if you read the texts that are mentioned in the books, the sources, this was all about religion, right?
Well, actually,
Mhm.
to some extent, it's not. Religion is there, but it's also about profit because, like in the ancient world, especially in the Middle East, uh, you take you when you like you grab when you go to war, you grab up the peasants, or maybe you do have a professional army, but they also part of their pay comes from what they can ransack from the people. So it is like back then the invasions were profitable for the
Yes.
ruling class and for the soldiers.
Yeah, no, that's true, and so profit was part of it because if you partook as a Muslim, if you lost your life in battle, then you would go to heaven, right? That was you would die a martyr. That's pretty much the only way to be guaranteed somewhat in Islam to go to heaven.
Like
Um,
Viking religion, where you die
yeah,
with a
and
sword in your hand, you go to
so
Valhalla.
there are a lot of volunteers, and actually the Berbers played an important role in this as well. That were freshly converted. A lot of them were still pagans actually, but they were very zealous, right? And I think that you could keep 20% of the bounty,
There you go.
and the rest. So there were actually people that were overseeing this warfare, that because there are rules in Islam on how to do this, and there were actually people that were directly linked to Muhammad, so that were working and serving under him. And I have that. Let me see. I have their names further down. in my text. We'll get to it, but I think they're called Curion. Anyway, but they were actually there to make sure that the people were converted properly, and that the bounty was distributed evenly. And also, when it comes to slavery, there's all these rules about like they would take thousands of women and take them with them to back to what is nowadays Iraq. And anyway, so that was all part of the spoil, right? Yes, and there are rules regarding all of this. Anyway, so yeah, but a little bit more about Spain. So the Spaniards were actually, or Spain itself had actually seen a lot of different cultures living there, from Celts to Carthaginians to Greeks, and later Germanic tribes such as the Vandals and the Visigoths. But the people in Spain, as nobody talked about Iberia at the time, but everybody would just call it Spain and the Spaniards. The Arabs didn't call it al-Andalus either. They just called it Spain. It's something they just used afterwards for whatever reason.
Probably because no, I don't know why. Never mind.
Okay.
But yeah, I know the Romans, they called it the province of Hispalis. So I think that's the word, right? Hispalis.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then there was a province they had in North Africa called Mauritania, which is not to be confused with the country of Mauritania, which basically hijacked the name. But the province of Mauritania was named after the Maori, which was the Roman name for the tribe of Berbers that was living there. So
okay.
That's where the term Moors comes from. Like in Spanish, they called them Moro.
Yeah, or Morosco, I believe. But anyway, I mean, the book really goes into detail in those things, and I don't remember all of those parts. But what I found interesting is that the Spaniards were they were very much Latinized or Romanized compared to the rest of Europe, because they were part of the Roman Empire for a long time, and before that there were many Greek settlements there even. And the Visigoths were some of the most Romanized Germanic tribes out there. And moreover, the southern part of Spain was actually still part of the Eastern Roman Empire. So not the Byzantine Empire, that actually didn't exist. It's a 16th century invention, that name. They would just call themselves Romans or maybe Greeks. And they were actively engaged, talking, trading with the Visigoths, also fighting them. But there was a lot of cultural exchange at the time. There were people that were well versed in the ancient texts. There were, anyway, these were not backwards people. This was not dark medieval Spain at all, which is what they like to pretend. So it was actually one of the most advanced societies in Europe at the time. Maybe together with the Persians, right? The Eastern Romans were the most advanced people altogether. If you look at Constantinople, I mean,
you got to remember China was also around.
Yeah, sure. Persians were really advanced as well, and they were, they fell actually around the same time to Islam. Yeah. So anyway, so the book starts with talking about how jihad is now painted as an internal struggle, but then it actually uses countless examples of contemporary Arab historians historians of the time, talking about jihad in one way only is to fight the infidels and expand the rule of Dar al-Islam, which is the house of Islam, versus Dar al-Harb, which is the house of war.
Yep.
So which is actually what we would live in right now. In fact, it was part of the ruler's obligation to at least wage jihad once a year. And the Muslim historians al-Qardabus and Abd al-Wahid write that Musa ibn Nusayr, an Arab general, quote, sacked, enslaved, and spent 3 years waging jihad against the Spanish infidels. So many modern scholars want to pretend that the invasion wasn't religiously motivated. Sure, there was a lot of money to be made, a lot of bounty, but the author does an excellent job giving numerous examples of why it was. Muslim sources talk about the Tabi'un, so that's Tabiun. That's a generation of pious Muslims who were direct disciples of Muhammad's companions, and how they entered Spain to direct the jihad and to oversee the conversion of the land. So the next myth is that the Arabs brought with them a rich culture into a dark medieval land. And actually, the invaders were mostly illiterate Bedouin Arabs. Most of them couldn't write.
Wait.
Yes.
Bedouins are
yes.
because like the book I read a book years ago about Spain, and I forget what the book was called, but that guy said that most of the invaders were actually indigenous North Africans, and very few of them were actual true Arabs.
Yeah, the Arabs were leading the assault. They were the generals, and the vast majority of the forces were converted Berbers, so that those would be your North African inhabitants.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, but they came from a culture that was, if you would compare it to the Romanized Spaniards, both these cultures would be way behind, right?
Yeah.
So, and then they also mentioned that he mentions that the religious version of Islam that was prevalent in Spain was from the Maliki school. Excuse me, and that's a very, very strict version of Islam that justifies the burnings of towns of infidels in jihad. And so was, quote, flooding them and cutting their trees and their fruits, killing their animals and destroying their buildings and all that can be broken down. So al-Mansur, one of the supposedly tolerant Umayyad caliphs, he ordered all the philosophy and logic books in Cordoba to be publicly burned. Now, the Maliki school was an extremely conservative version of Islam. There was an internal struggle. This school fought won, and it was the religious law, Sharia law, that was applied in Spain. And if you were to compare it to today, it would be something you would find in like Saudi Arabia, Iran, or even maybe ISIS-controlled areas. So this al-Mansur guy, he was actually so devoted to jihad that in a single year he sent 5 expeditions against the Christian kingdoms and demolished the entire city of Leon. And during this conquest, they discovered great treasure in architecture. The Muslim chronicle Al-Razi actually observed that a Visigoth bridge over the Tagus River was, quote, so well built that there was nothing like it in the whole of Spain, and that a Muslim leader ordered it destroyed. Yeah. So great Visigoth statues were taken down and melted as they were considered an idol. But it was also a part of the humiliation, right, of the dhimmis, which is the people that were Christians and Jews of the book. So people of the book that were living under Islamic law. And part of it was the jizya, which was a tax that they had to pay. It was kind of like a mafia tax, protection money.
Yeah, if you don't pay it, then you have to either convert or they're going to take your head off.
Yeah, exactly.
Jizya tax. That
was a jizya tax, and yeah. So and it also shows here, like it talks about like how destructive this conquest was, like the sources, like the destruction of churches, taking of slaves, mass executions. But it also talks about the splendor of the Visigoth society. Like one of the historians, he narrates that one of the men found in a treasure hidden by fleeing Christians numerous of emeralds and rubies in such abundance as no man had seen before, and they were astonished. They exclaimed, Let us send for Emir Musa so he can see the treasures with his own eyes. Otherwise, he will not believe us.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so another Muslim historian wrote that he describes the former Visigoth palace in Cordoba as full of wonderful remains of the Greeks, Romans, and Goths. The interior apartments were so magnificently decorated as to dazzle with the beauty of their ornaments the eyes of the beholders. And so, in comparison, another historian, Ibn Khaldun, he underlined the low cultural level of Muslim Arabs prior to their being civilized by Greeks and Persians. So he wrote, quote, "The Arabs were coarse, without education, and not very skilled in the arts of writing and mathematics. Thus they used Jews, Christians, and foreigners to handle their administrative affairs." The Arabs, barely knowing, coming out of their nomadic existence, were too busy in their armies even to pay attention to scientific knowledge. So yeah, there's just so much to cover. And like, I'm beginning to sense there's no way to cover it all. So maybe just a couple topics I want to discuss. Churches, right? So the founder of the Emirate of Cordoba, Umayyad Abd al-Rahman I, he consistently burned churches and relics. When Muslim chroniclers, they mention churches, it's usually to gloat over their destruction. The Mosque of Cordoba was built, so that's the famous mosque that you can visit nowadays.
Yeah, I visited it, actually. I have pictures of it somewhere.
So it was actually built on the rubble of the Church of Saint Vincent.
Yeah, I heard that.
So in fact, it's actually the main facade was used as the facade of the mosque. And this was common because the materials used by the Spaniards and the Visigoths were vastly superior to what the Arabs had.
Were they still using the old Roman concrete?
And they were using the old Roman arches, and those were repurposed in mosques. Yeah, so I don't know about the concrete itself. That's a good question.
That might make a good video topic, the Roman concrete that they used.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because their concrete was better than what we have today. That's why a lot of the buildings are still around. Like the Roman concrete, they lost the secret of it until like a few years ago. There were some scientists who think they uncovered it, but I think that's another topic for that could be a topic all by itself.
It's like Greek fire, right? It's also one of those missing ingredients. They don't know how to make it anymore. But yeah,
some weird stuff in the ancient world that we should probably do a video on that, actually, as bonus content, like weird inventions from the ancient world.
That's a good one. Yeah. But anyway, so in the conquest of Spain, they actually followed like a similar pattern to North Africa, which was also mostly Christian at the time. Right? They destroyed most of the churches and monasteries and built mosques that were specifically designed to dwarf any churches that might remain.
Yeah.
Those mosques were often designed and constructed by Christian engineers and workers, as anything built by Arabs wouldn't last very long. So the great Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, and Omran in Cairo, they were all built by Christian Greek architects. The mosque in Damascus, again, was built on top of what was the great Greek Basilica of St. John the Baptist, again with the conscious intention to dwarf and humiliate the neighboring Christian churches. Similar in Spain, it was not allowed to build new churches without permission. Sometimes the Christians were only allowed to build one outside of the city, and even for repairs of the church, they had to get approval of the Muslim rulers. And this might sound familiar because this is still the way it's for many Christians living in countries like Egypt, which you mentioned before.
So I was going to say that's the law in Egypt.
Yeah, and that's directly from Sharia law. That's Islamic law. And my second point is that it was Islamic law that governed Islamic Spain. And unlike the Roman Visigoths, who had a secular law outside of the church law, everything in Islamic Spain was ruled by Sharia law. and everything and everyone was subject to Sharia law, as explained by the Maliki school, this really conservative version of Islam. And so here actually lies the key why Islamic Spain was much closer to ISIS, which it wasn't, right? But it was closer to that than to being a shining beacon of tolerance that some modern scholars make it out to be. Muslim women were closely monitored, and they had way fewer freedoms compared to their Christian Visigoth counterparts, who actually had a lot of freedoms because they were coming from a Germanic tribe that where women traditionally were free to own land, trade, leave the house without being accompanied, right? Have their hair open and their faces, because even the faces had to be covered by the Muslims, women. They were free to mingle with men, and some of them would rule towns or small cities, and even you would have queens, right? Or later on empresses. But anyway, and some of them would were free to pursue intellectual endeavors. And they make it sound like these Muslim women were so free and to do what they want, but like even some of the examples they give, where it was Muslim women teaching, it was like, yes, but they had to use a separate entrance from the men, and all the men, like the woman had to sit behind a curtain. And even that, like, fully covered up. And even then, there were people saying this was not the right way of life. It wasn't right. And if you compare it to like somebody like Hildegard von Bingen, anyway, and there's so just actually several intellectual women from the medieval Christian time that I can mention here that we could go into, and it would make a good topic actually.
Yeah,
yeah. It's just like no comparison. So to switch this around and pretend like it was way more open there, and sometimes they would use sources that were like romantic poems, but these romantic poems were actually written regarding slave girls, right? So these were so they had more freedoms because they were like, they weren't considered. They weren't free. Like they were able to get away with more because they were somebody's property. But even for them, there were like certain laws they had to stick to. And if you don't listen, then there was always the religious police, right? That would come for you. And these religious laws also made it very hard for the coming together of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. For example, because there were all these cleansing rites that the Muslims had to obey to be in contact with infidels, meaning Christians or Jews.
Anybody who's outside the community.
Yeah, and it's not allowed for them to make friends with Christians. Like some people got too close, like some rulers got too close with Christians, they would be killed, beheaded. It wasn't allowed for Muslims to bathe in the same water as Christians. They weren't allowed to use the same plates or cups or cutlery, drink from the same well, stuff like that. Stuff like that still comes up in Pakistan nowadays, in modern days. So anyway, it meant that actually Jews had some similar rules in place, and it just meant that everybody would just live in their own separate neighborhoods. There was always religious police around, and of course the most wealthy people would get away with things. But for commoners, there was no drinking, no music allowed. They would bust into a house and administer severe punishments. That started with like lashings, going to like the removal of limbs for stealing, to stoning and beheading or crucifixion and worse. This jizya that you meant before, the Muslim tax, it was actually protection money. It was collected under public humiliation as well. So it was like people would be like cursed at, and then they were like be grabbed at the throat and tell them to pay up. And sometimes people like Christian would be there would be people testifying that Christian had insulted Islam somehow, for which you'd get the death penalty. And because in Islamic law, a Muslim's voice counts for two, their testimony counts for two, and a Christian only for one. So another interesting part is to look at the martyrs of Cordoba. Did you see anything about that while you were there?
No. I didn't actually. I did take all kinds of pictures and stuff, and I actually didn't like. The changes they made to the Mosque of Cordoba when they turned it into a church. I mean, I understand turning it into a church because a church was there first, but the European Gothic architecture does not at all, in any way, match with the architecture that the Moors used, and it really does. I mean, while everything is well done, it doesn't match at all. It's like oil and water, and because of that, I didn't think the mosque was very nice. The former mosque.
Okay.
That's kind of off topic, but
yeah,
if anybody goes there, you'll see it. It's like, why would you? I mean, I understand culturally, like they did it to us, so we're doing it back, and everything is very well done, but it doesn't match. It's like having a tennis shoe on one foot and then like a penny loafer on the other. Like, why would you do that? But go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, yeah, that's fine. That's it.
When you go there, you with one good thing.
I've been to Barcelona and Madrid, but never here. So
maybe you can stop there on your way down to visit the Guanches when you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. First I got to go by the what was it again? Normandy and the Vendée region, and Brittany, right, as well. But yeah. But yeah, man, it's anyway, like it's a long story. Like again, like there's all these martyrs. Like there was a nun that was thrown into a cauldron of molten lead. Yeah, there were public executions. A monk was lashed to death. A soldier, Sancho, was impaled. But then there's these modern scholars that say, oh, these were just some kind of extremist Christians, right? And really all they were doing is like, it was like a last ditch effort. And they would say like, well, we don't believe Muhammad was a prophet. And that's why they would be get killed. But it was like an act of desperation because, slowly but surely they were being squeezed to death by the taxes. If you wanted to hold any position of power, you had to convert. A lot of them were like, there were rebellions, and then those would be squashed, and people would be like thousands of people would be moved into slavery into Africa, and Muslim men were allowed to marry Christian women, and then the children would automatically be Muslim, but Christian men were not allowed to marry Muslim women. So, and then with Muslims being allowed to have more than one wife, higher birth rates, in the end, there were just hardly any Christians left, right? Many of them were also fleeing to like the northern parts, the Pyrenees, and so yeah, it was anything but like a happy convivencia of cultures, not at all. So, and even some of the people that had adopted Islamic culture and religion, although sometimes in name only, I believe they were the Moriscos. They were treated poorly. Like they were really like not trusted as much. So when they rebelled, there was like there was a lot of fights everywhere, a lot of rebellions, a lot of anyway. So when the Reconquista was successful, they found entire areas that were completely devoid of any Christians or Jews whatsoever. Right, churches were destroyed, and it took centuries for Spain to recover the 7 centuries of development it could have had if it hadn't been occupied. And if it had still been able to communicate freely with the Eastern Roman Empire. And that was also a big thing. It's like, well, the Muslim world kind of became the middleman between the Eastern Roman Empire and these Christians living there. But they had no choice. So it's kind of like they were the reason for the situation that we're in, and also the remedy, I guess. But it's anyway. But to say that they were like enabling all this, like they had no choice. They were in direct contact before. Anyway, there's just so much, in this book. Um, talking about the hardships and discrimination that people face, like how they had to wear specific clothing so they could be recognized, and also like how they conquered, like the Muslims when they conquered the Christian kingdoms. They would even make like all these, if you work with us, we'll give you all these freedoms and stuff. And then like shortly after, they would break their word because in Islam, like you can only make temporary agreements with infidels, and they don't really,
Okay.
yeah. And that's really interesting, right? And you're allowed to lie to infidels. I think it's called taqiyya.
That's what taqiyya, like they have situational ethics kind of built into their law. Like take the Bible for example. It just says thou shalt not lie. It doesn't give any conditions. And one of the things it says is liars will be the first into hell. So even if you're dealing with an unbeliever, you are still not supposed to lie. Like it also says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything more than that is evil. So like it's a fixed set of morality, right? There's not, you treat this person that way and that person this way based on the situation. Whereas with taqiyya, it's like, well, you only have to keep your word to, there's all sorts of exceptions and loopholes. Like you only have to keep your word to the fellow believers. But then, Islam also has this tendency to purity spiral. You know what purity spiraling is, right?
Is that though? That's also described in the book as when they believed one of their soldiers or commanders wasn't religious enough, then you were allowed to take them out.
It's kind of like pushing the goalpost where you have a spiral that's kind of never ending. Like the people, for example, there's people with race ideologies where like, oh, we want to have our country be completely like group X. But then you start going into the DNA and, oh, this person is, part, well, is part something else. And then you say, okay, well, we're going to get rid of all the people that have DNA that's like non-European, for example. But then they narrow it down more and they say, well, people from Southern Europe or people from Eastern Europe. And then after that they narrow it down more. Like any culture can do that. And then there's also ideological purity spiraling where you have this ideology, everybody adheres to it. Like think of like communism with the struggle sessions, or like Pol Pot, where they get rid of all the capitalists, but then they want to get rid of all the people with glasses and all the people that brush their teeth, And with
they
Islam,
have like religious police going around, right? So it's always like you start spying on each other, and if people like you had people that like said they converted to Islam, but then they were actually still Catholic, and then because of that, the punishment for that was death. So there was always
people, and then it's like, well, your robe is too short, and your beard is too short, and all that. Like they always find something else. There's always the next frontier. That's a purity spiral. Like wherever you're trying to narrow it down, and then when you narrow it down again, because you're trying to achieve some purity, which actually isn't a fixed quantity. So you just keep excluding.
You keep adding to it. Yeah, man. But actually, one more thing is that apparently the Jews played an important part in the conquest of Spain.
Oh yeah,
because they collaborated with the Muslims and they would actually help guard cities. And that way the Muslim armies could move on to the next city quickly. And then the Jews would get like temporary benefits as well, but those wouldn't last either. In the end, they were also discriminated against. But yeah, it's an interesting part. And what I wanted to say is like, like people will say like Islamophobia, right? Like well, if you lived in this, which is kind of like a slur to, I feel like, to shut down. Like you can be like hating Islam, I guess.
Yeah, I don't consider it to be a word. That wasn't a word.
Yeah,
That wasn't in the dictionary when I was a kid.
that's
You know.
something to really. I feel like it's mostly used to shut down any kind of criticism. But
Yeah.
on the one hand, like like the laws that they had, like these laws were not all that different to what the Jews had at the time to keep their, except they weren't in power, of course, really. But they also had a lot of Jews on, rules on how to keep the religion clean. And actually, the Christians under Islamic law, they also came up with a lot of rules to make sure that as little or as few of the people converted as possible to try to kind of keep their community alive.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, let's face it. Like even the Christians before the invasion, they were having similar rules or laws when it came to the Jews. Like they would make it really hard for the Jews to live in Christian Spain, and they had all these laws on like trying to get them to convert and make their lives as difficult as possible. But the difference is that it's still a myth, right? It wasn't a happy-go-lucky melting pot of cultures
Yeah.
where everybody was free to do as they liked. That's couldn't be further from the truth. And so I think it's good to talk about like the way history is the way it is, and you shouldn't use it to kind of paint some picture that isn't so. And B, the reason that why it wasn't the case is because of some of these Islamic laws that are still being used in countries today, like Iran, like Pakistan. Like you wouldn't want to be a Hindu in Pakistan today or a
Oh,
Christian, for
no.
example.
Yeah.
And a lot of the reasons behind it are directly related to what was taking place in Islamic Spain. So, I don't want to be like, like if you're a Hindu living in Pakistan, there's probably a reason to have a phobia when it comes to Islam. And the same for Iran, right?
Yeah, and I have a problem with the word phobia because it implies that it's an irrational fear, like, agoraphobia or claustrophobia, where you're just afraid because something is a small space or whatever, and it's not based on rational things. Whereas, being concerned, not wanting to be taken over by Islam, is not an irrational fear, because you need only look at those countries and say, well, which one would I like to live in? Would I like to live in Pakistan or Afghanistan or Egypt or, Syria or Iraq? Like, I wouldn't choose any of the above.
No, exactly. So and it's used to really just shut down any kind of.
Though I actually do kind of like Syria for different reasons, like because of Damascus, and I like this. I kind of like. There is a good Syrian Orthodox. Anyways, that's another thing. Let's just.
That's another story altogether. Anyway, that was my story, and
Great.
yeah, it's a very long one. I realize.
That's
But
okay, man.
yeah, it's a good book. I'll put a link in the description, and if anybody wants to read it, it's not a ton of like reading, and like some people were like rating it super low. Like, yeah, maybe sometimes the book is I think so. Like,
Review bomb.
and yeah, like and they'll like be nitpicking stuff, like even if it's not 100% correct, and there's probably some places where this writer is trying to overcompensate out of frustration or whatever reason. You cannot deny like a lot of these sources that are being quoted in the book, and it paints a pretty clear picture of a different version of Spain as to the one that tends to be presented to us. So yeah. Anyway, I thought it was interesting. If you have any comments on this one, let us know. Any recommendations? Anything else from you, Ivor?
Um, anything else for me? Like, Yeah, I think I pretty much interrupted you to say all of my comments that I would say. You know, I have been there. Like I went to Cordoba and I also went to Granada, and I
Hmm.
saw the Generalife and stuff like that. And yeah, I mean, it's. I know one thing is that about our ancestors that I think the Muslims did do better is sanitation, because our ancestors were pretty barbaric after the Roman Empire fell when it come to things like washing and like basic things like not drinking after other people and washing your hands. Those were weak areas, and of course the Muslims, they didn't do those things for
They do it
scientific.
for religious
They
reasons.
did it for
They're
religious
yeah.
reasons, for
Hmm.
spiritual purity, not so much for physical purity. And I think the only reason they even had those things is because they copycatted them from Judaism. But yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty much, you covered it pretty well. And
Yeah, although they did have a large bathing culture actually already in the Greek Roman parts of the country, which they
yeah, from the
inherited there.
Romans, though,
Yeah.
not like the rest of Europe that was outside of the Roman
Yeah,
Empire.
not the Visigoths, although the Visigoths were happily adapting Roman life because it was vastly superior to what they were coming from. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's good. Like hold on.
All right, man. Maybe we should cut it off.
Yeah, I think
All
we're
right.
down to